Hi everyone, Chris here. This is season 6 of The Wild. 8 special episodes recorded on location in America's national parks. Stories about their biodiversity, their complex histories, and how they are protecting nature. From the tallest trees on the planet to the hottest place on Earth. From trout to fireflies, and wolves to rivers. I'm so glad you're here. Enjoy the show. Okay, I can tell already I'm going to get neck ache this week. I've just jumped out of my truck at the side of a long, winding road. It's dark and the sky is really heavy. Oh! Lightning! Holy sh**! I was less than a mile away. I've driven 600 miles from home to this forest in Redwood National and State Parks. And as soon as I cross the border into this protected park, just like that, I'm in a grove of some of the tallest trees on the planet. I've never seen anything like it. Immediately, it feels like another world. These are giant coastal redwoods, and their home here in Northern California is a powerful place. Raw and energetic and ancient, dripping with life, and very wet. But as I carry on a bit further down the road, it's a different story. A reminder of the grim past. I'm driving down this road and it's eerie because it's just lined as far as you can see with massive redwood stumps. It feels like driving through a redwood graveyard in some ways. For 20 million years, the redwoods grew here along the coast of Northern California. It's massive forests stretching for 700 miles. 2 million acres of some of the oldest trees on Earth. A redwood can live for over 2,000 years. From the top of one, you'd be looking down on the Statue of Liberty. But then, the logging began. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. That just gives you some idea of how many of these massive trees are cut down in that last 30 yards of this road. As gold fever in California ended in the 1850s, redwood fever took over. In a mad frenzy of logging, 95% of these enormous trees were cut down. This was before steel was widely used, so the strong, rot-resistant redwood was a primary building material for entire cities like San Francisco. It was used for railroad ties, even pipelines and storage tanks. The ancient human history these trees have lived through is part of the story too. The Yurok and other indigenous tribes have lived here among these trees and used them sustainably for thousands of years.
We didn't cut down redwood trees. We waited for them to fall, and there was thousands of these redwood trees around, so we didn't have to cut anything down because they were naturally falling.
But the greed of the 1800s and European settlers changed all of that. 80% of the native peoples in California were killed. As the forests were destroyed, hundreds of species of plants and animals they were home to disappeared with them. Now the race is on to bring the trees and the forests back, and that race begins here in Redwood National and State Parks. Just saw a logging truck hurtling down here.
That's where we're going.
And one plan to bring the giant coastal redwoods back involves cutting them down. From KOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to The Wild. It's early November, and I'm just waking up in my truck camper to the sound of the Pacific. It's roaring in the background. It was hard to sleep last night. It's a constant around here, and so is the morning fog, a blanket of moisture delivered from the ocean to the surrounding forest. I've come to Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California to learn more about the story of the giant coastal redwoods. 1,000,000 miles from Hollywood, another 700 miles south, but almost as famous. The trees here dwarf any I've seen before, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, a place full of big trees. The history of how these trees were protected is fascinating. After the intensive logging that decimated the forests starting in the 1850s, a handful of passionate people banded together urgently to save the trees that were left, often one grove of redwoods at a time. Then in the 1920s, the state of California jumped in to help through their state park system. They created 3 of them: Jedediah Smith, Del Norte Coast, and Prairie Creek Redwoods State Parks. It was only in 1968 that Redwood National Park was formed. Together, they're called Redwood National and State Parks. It's a partnership that manages these forests together in a pretty unique relationship. And on top of that, it's also a World Heritage Site. I've come to one of those redwood groves to experience the trees for myself. This one's called Ladybird Johnson Grove, and walking into it is just magical. It's absolutely breathtaking. All around through this forest, I'm surrounded by these big old growth redwoods. It's so green. There's not a square inch of the ground without life on it. Old growth trees are the ones that somehow survived the logging, and they pulse with life. Life that needs these trees. There are 5 different species of ferns and banana slugs, salamanders, black bears graze, mountain lions den, red squirrels build drays, and brown bats feast on insects. There's salmon and trout swimming in the streams, and there are elk and garter snakes, ravens cruising through. It's really magic. This tree in front of us has just come alive with the sound of all these little birds. Chickadees mostly, and some nuthatches in there I think I can hear. There's maybe a flock of 40 or 50 of them just flitting around among the needles and in the canopy of the tree way up high. Different species use different parts of the tree, different niches. These birds, they're no bigger than my pinky. They're picking tiny insects from the delicate outer branches. Forests everywhere are crucial for the world's biodiversity. But here in an old-growth redwood forest, biodiversity, the amount of life they support, is high because of the old age and enormous size of these trees. And being big and old, they can remove more carbon from the air and store it longer than any other tree species. This is a giant, one of the biggest trees in this grove, and it's hard to express how tall and thick it is, but I'm going to try and walk around the whole circumference of the bottom of this tree, see how long it takes. So here I am right at the edge of the tree here, right at the base. A big redwood tree like this weighs about 500 tons, about 4 times heavier than the blue whale, the largest animal that's ever lived. Still walking. It would take about 10 people linking arms to stretch around it. The root buttresses at the base look like dinosaur toes, and there are these round, bulbous protrusions that look kind of like wax dripping from an enormous candle. I'm about halfway. These are kind of dormant shoots waiting to sprout if the tree is cut down or feels threatened. Amazing. An old tree like this isn't just a giant carbon sequestration system. They purify water, control floods, prevent erosion, they cycle nutrients, and they breathe out huge amounts of oxygen. And there's the beginning. Back to where I started. That's amazing. But there's also a lot going on in the tiny details on this giant tree. What I'm here to learn about is the life on a redwood. And to understand that, you gotta climb one.
I always say, like, you know, you don't climb a ladder with your arms. You climb a ladder with your legs. So we're going to be using our legs quite a bit.
This is Dr. Lucy Kahulis. She's a professor of tree physiology. Very cool. Her job at Cal Poly Humboldt University here in Northern California is to study how trees are adapted to live. One of her specialties is the giant coastal redwood, and she's talked me into climbing one of them that's growing on her property up by the town of Arcata.
I'm going to take the ascender off of my harness and put this one on there.
Her husband Nick helps to rig us up. Finally, I've squeezed into a climbing harness that's 2 sizes too small. And I've started hoisting my 230 pounds up a very tall redwood.
And then the motion is sort of like inchworm-like. It's a jug. So you slide your lower ascender up, and then you sit down, and then bring this up, and then stand with your legs and move your upper ascender up.
Part of Lucy's research looks at the many organisms that call a redwood home. Each level, each layer of the ecosystem going upwards is different. So her work involves climbing through those layers from the ground level to the very top. Okay. Pulleys, ropes, and carabiners in place. I start to inch up the tree with her, slowly. Like if you need to go for dinner and stuff and then wake up for breakfast while I still make it up there, just...
It's going to be a journey. You're doing great.
The tallest redwood is about 380 feet high. This one's about 100 feet, about as tall as a 10-story building. We're just a few feet off the ground, but it's already a new close-up perspective. Here down low, the brown bark is thick and wet.
So the spongy bark definitely, like sometimes you press up against a redwood tree and you're like soaked up, you know, your pant has this big wet mark on it because the bark is so spongy and wet.
Yeah, it feels like if you had a screwdriver, you could push it in there several inches almost, you know. The redwoods kind of stop the foggy air that rolls in from the ocean. The trees catch that thick air. They absorb the rain and fog and store it in their bark. It's a water supply, and it helps them survive drought and fire. All this moisture creates a microclimate and habitat for other species, like mosses. They're in every nook and cranny of the bark. A mature redwood can drink over 150 gallons of water a day, and nearly half of that comes from the fog. Saves pumping it all 30 stories up.
My friend Alana called it sipping from the clouds.
Redwoods can grow up to 10 feet a year, partly because of this incredibly well-adapted water management system. Cool, should we go a bit higher?
Yeah.
We climb into the next layer, about 3 or 4 stories up, and these new features show up like little round scars. Lucy tells me it's what's left after the redwood gives itself a haircut. They shed these lower branches that don't get enough light.
They basically were kicked off the island, you know. They self-pruned. They weren't making enough sugar, essentially, to pay their way. And the bark will eventually kind of grow over them, but for decades, you can still see kind of the remnants of where the base of the branch used to connect to the tree.
Over time, the branches snap and trees fall, or some other kind of disturbance happens. The dead branches join the messy forest floor. And over hundreds of years, that helps make these old redwood forests such great habitat for all sorts of creatures.
It's the disturbances and the traumas that have happened to them that make them kind of cool.
Oh, there's a lesson for life in there somewhere.
There is, yeah.
You know, it's the knocks and punches that make you the character that you can become. 40 minutes into the climb, 6 or 7 stories up, and we enter an important layer of this upward ecosystem. Oh yeah, we made it up here quite a way. Look at that.
So we're officially at the base of the live crown.
The live crown is where the trunk of the redwood starts sprouting a bunch of branches and needles, a tangle of life that feels more alive. Immediately my eyes are flooded with lichens and fungi, tons of different greens and greys and yellows, all spread throughout the needles. And branches that we now have to work our ropes around.
And then here we're starting to get some crustose lichens. They're like a light green on top, and then they're black on the underside, and they're puffy, kind of like a Rice Krispie. If you dissect them, they're hollow inside.
The lichens and mosses provide a substrate and a layer of soil for other plants to take root, called epiphytes. Plants that grow on other plants and trees, like huckleberries. Quite big huckleberry bushes grow right on the branches in this middle zone. And all it takes is for a bird to poop a nice little package of nitrogen here to help the plants along. Tree voles and squirrels nest up here, using the tops of the branches like aerial highways.
It looks like you're getting the hang of jugging.
Yeah, about time now that we're at the top. We've made it, the last upper zone of the tree, 10 stories up. I sit back in my harness and try to take it in. Whoa, there's the Pacific.
Yeah.
Holy cow, it is overwhelming. So how high do you think we are now? Holy smokes, that's a long way down. We're high up among bald eagle perches and nesting sites for endangered marbled murrelet seabirds. Lucy says scientists have found hundreds of different species living in and among redwood trees. It really brings it into perspective being able to see the ocean from the top of a redwood. How do you feel when you're up here at the top of a redwood?
I guess I feel reverent. Just seeing these trees that have been in one place for 2,000 years is really inspiring. It's, whatever problems have come their way during that long period of time, they've had to stand their ground and kind of endure and get through it. They can't get up and move, They have to kind of sit there and weather through the storm.
These are giant, rounded planks. Are they from a redwood? Mm-hmm. The next day, I'm still up the tree. No, I'm kidding. I made it down. And now I'm standing next to a house in a small meadow in the forest.
Yeah, so these redwood planks would be kind of maintained and constructed with elkhorn and fire.
Maya Rayner works for the California State Parks. She's from the local Yurok tribe. Redwood National and State Parks are located on their ancestral lands. Maya's describing a reconstructed Yurok village of wooden houses.
Techniques, and so what you're seeing is the aftermath of, hand carving, hand smoothing a lot of these pieces so that they look uniform or so they fit in a specific spot.
There's probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 30 giant planks, 2 layers deep. Like 12-foot-long shingles made of redwood. You can still see the growth rings on them. The houses are sunken into the ground. Maya is in her early 20s, and part of her job is educating park visitors about the Yurok's long history with giant redwoods. How they lived sustainably, right here with the forest.
I try to compare it to modern day. Like when I talk about the houses, it is a little bit like I feel like a real estate agent, and I'm like, there's this top level, and then there's the lower level, and then you have the roof, and the roof has all these features of like being able to have rain fall down the homes, and just like things that like you would hear like on a TV show, like reality TV.
There's a round hole down low in the wall of the house. It's the front door. I get down on all fours and crawl inside.
Grizzly bear couldn't do that.
Oh, wow. It's dark in here. There's a big fire pit in the middle of the earthen floor. Maya, do you come here? Did community members come here to use these buildings, or is that not allowed?
Yeah, we sleep in them.
You do?
During ceremony, yeah. I've slept in the open house 4 or 5 times now within my lifetime. during a ceremony.
I can only imagine just how cozy and happy a space would have been like this would have been, you know.
Yeah, it's one of the warmest places I've ever slept. Like,
Really?
you're like sweating.
Yeah.
Yeah, comforting, really comforting, because that's just like how my childhood has been and how I, hope to see my future and continue with being able to participate in ceremony, because it's just, a different type of connection. It's a different kind of family.
The Yurok used redwood trees for all kinds of things like furniture and canoes and the houses we're seeing. But they didn't cut them down. They used wood from trees that had fallen in the forest.
And there was thousands of these redwood trees around, so we didn't have to cut anything down because they were naturally falling. They were naturally, taking care of themselves, and we were using them, for a different purpose.
The irony is that the mosaic of protected national and state parks here saved the last of the trees from logging, but they also cut off access to the trees for local Indigenous people. These state parks and national parks, they limit Indigenous people's, Yurok people's access to redwoods that are so important culturally. How does that feel? Do these places protect them too much? That's tough for me to even ask you because you're sitting there wearing a California State Parks badge on your shoulder, right?
I mean,
is it something that comes up?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to understand that perspective. It is almost like walking into someone's house and saying, you can't use those pans. No, you can't use the pans. You can't use that chair anymore. It's not your chair anymore. I'm going to take it. I'm going to use it for something else because it's going to help me. But what about the Indigenous people that have been here, for 10,000 years, that have been in relationship with the land? We've been told these stories since we were children, talking about how we had an abundance of everything just to grow up in a system that doesn't, support us.
I can tell there's a tension for Maya, working for the park system that's occupying the land stolen from her ancestors. But she wants to see the redwood forests brought back to their former abundance.
Every Yurok family, every Tolwa family, every Hupa family that had access to these resources should be able to have access again.
And bringing back those resources, it's something that the park is working on. But how do you retrofit a redwood forest? How do you bring more of these big old trees back and all the life they support?
It really is, yeah. I mean, this is part of the story, is that we have to kill some of these trees in order to help the forest as a whole stay healthy.
One possible solution that's being tried is cutting some of the redwoods down. I'll explain that after the break. Wow.
Well, this is where it's all happening then.
It's mixed emotions. I'm a tree lover.
It is. It takes a little getting used to. I'm the same way. I'm certainly a tree hugger at heart. But
it's chilly the next morning, and I'm wearing a red hard hat, walking up a steep, muddy road with Lathrop Leonard, a forester with California State Parks. He's brought me to a key spot for the Redwood National and State Parks, which is weird because everywhere I look are felled trees, fresh-cut logs. 4 guys are working this section with 3-foot chainsaws. They stop work to wait for us to walk by. 1 big tree, 2, 3 big trees across the road that have just been felled. There used to be redwoods as wide as a 3-car garage here until they were logged 100+ years ago. Now it's packed with much smaller redwoods and fir trees that replaced them back then. Some of them grew naturally, some were planted.
And you see this clump of trees here, this is classic. Those are all growing from one stump, right? So there was one big tree, and now there's, 10 trees coming up from that one stump. So
when the loggers cut down the old-growth redwoods way back when, it triggered that clever redwood response. They sprouted new growth. Those shoots themselves became trees all at once. And the theory is that too many of these growing from all those stumps They're crowding each other out. They're competing for water and light and soil.
And instead of thinking about, oh, I hate to kill this tree, I think a little bit more about, oh, this tree next to the tree, how happy is that tree going to be that it's got all this extra space and this extra light, and it's going to be able to grow better for it. So I think shifting the focus away from what you're killing to what you're helping. And of course, not only helping the individual tree, but the ecosystem as a whole.
Left to nature, this situation of too many young trees all growing at once wouldn't happen. There'd be big old trees and some middle-aged trees and younger ones too. In other words, a healthy, messy mixture of it all at different stages. And the goal is to get back to that messy mix.
And so what we're really doing here is we're speeding up a natural process and taking down some of these trees out of the clump so that the ones that remain grow faster and become the big old-growth redwood trees.
There's one coming down right now. Holy smokes! Oh!
Right?
I've never been that close to a tree coming down. That is unbelievable. Wow. I tried to picture what it must have looked and sounded like in here in the logging heyday. Imagine a 500-ton redwood hitting the ground. Must have been like an earthquake. Some of the loggers who are working on these thinning operations now had family members who actually logged old-growth trees. As we're walking back down the logging road, one of the loggers upslope is watching us. He's leaning with his foot on a freshly cut stump, like a scene straight from the 1800s. His name is Derek Ford. He's the owner of the logging company the park has hired to do some of this second-growth thinning.
Back in the day, this was much different. You'd travel from camp to camp. My dad's dad was a powder monkey. These big logs, they would fall these big trees, and their equipment wasn't strong enough to move them.
Yeah. Imagine a 320-foot tree felled and lying in the forest, almost impossible to move, so a powder monkey would use dynamite to literally blast them into more manageable halves or quarters.
So actually the talent was, if you didn't put enough in, it didn't do anything, and if you put too much in, you ended up with a bunch of toothpicks. Of course, the timber company, they don't pay for toothpicks. That's a good way to get fired. For the most part, I think that they were working to support their families because of the old stories that I heard my dad tell. They were really poor. My dad remembers as a kid, he lived in someone's chicken house. He said you could see light through the walls. And they were happy with that, as long as they had a job.
I can tell Derek's proud of his logging heritage, but that he's perhaps even more proud of what he's doing today.
Nowadays, things are a lot different. You actually want to feel like you're doing a good deed at the end of the day. And that's how we feel here.
It's not clear if this thinning is the best solution. It's hard to picture the results, but Lathrop says he can help with that. On our way out, he takes me to a forest just a couple of miles away, where they tested to see if this thinning would actually work. An experiment from 20 years ago. So we're walking into a big forest experiment, like it's a laboratory, a living laboratory almost here.
Exactly.
And what are we looking at?
So what I'm seeing is that there's a whole bunch of trees in here really closely spaced together, and they're all kind of small and skinny, and there's not much live foliage on the trees like you see there.
When the loggers clear-cut the old growth in this area, they reseeded it with new trees, which created this crop of second-growth trees, small redwoods, all growing close together, crowded. This first section of the experiment that we're walking through right now is the control. Lathrop and his team haven't touched it since it was seeded over 30 years ago.
Like you see, the trees are so close together that the only live branches are at the very tip tops of the trees. Mm-hmm. And all the other branches are dead because there's just not enough sunlight getting to the forest floor down here.
Mm-hmm. Just because like an empty carpet of needles, basically, isn't it?
Exactly. We're in almost a desert. Like there's just zero biodiversity here compared.
So there are trees here, yes, but not much else. It's lifeless and barren, clean, almost clinical. Nothing like the messy and thriving look of nature in the layers of an old-growth forest.
Yeah. So now we're going to walk just next to this control area where we did nothing.
Yeah.
We're going to walk into an area that we thinned 20 years ago.
It's literally right next to it, a few paces away from the dead zone into this lush Jurassic Park.
And that's exactly the idea.
Wow.
We're standing on the line between these two treatment blocks. 20 years ago, both of these areas looked exactly the same.
Here, where the trees were thinned, there are shafts of sunlight coming through, illuminating the green plants on the forest floor. It even smells different, damp and alive. There's a lot of different plants growing here. It's so different to dead zone back there. What are you seeing? Which species?
Yeah, so I think in the control area where we did no thinning, I think a few sword ferns was about the only thing that I saw there. But look at this. We've got wild ginger growing. We've got trailing blackberry. We've got salmonberry. We've got cascaras. We've got grand firs.
A dozen different kinds of moss.
Oh, so many types of mosses. There's some bracken fern. Oh, this is vanilla grass here.
And of course, when you get this variety of berries, plants and trees, you get a boost in wild animal and bird biodiversity too.
I think about all the different animals that are reliant on old-growth forests that cannot survive without old-growth forests, and to be able to see them move back into this area and be able to use it the way they have been since time immemorial, like how special would that be?
The redwoods are critical to maintaining the biodiversity of these forests. The ultimate goal for this whole thinning effort is for a person to wander from an old-growth forest that has a few ancient redwoods left into this second growth area and not even realize it was ever logged. It's not a perfect solution. Some scientists say the cut redwoods will just sprout again, or that opening the forest floor up to more light will let other species take over, and perhaps even increase forest temperatures. It's complicated. But with so much conservation work, it's trial and error, and the results of this experiment won't be known for decades, left to future generations to understand.
If we can put the pieces out there and let nature kind of take over and make that happen, then I feel like, we've done our part to get things back to where they should be.
Back near the reconstructed Yurok village, I ask Maya Rayner, what's her perspective about the future of these redwood trees, maybe 100 years from now?
Redwood trees are kind of just like resilience to me. I see like this moving, changing thing that's going to outlive me, that's going to outlive, everyone that I know. And so, that's my hope for when we get to that point of like, it will be, normal to have everything move and change in the way that it was supposed to.
I leave my conversation with Maya and take one last hike through a beautiful redwood grove that was saved from the saws over 100 years ago. The trail ends where I'm camping, along sandy beach, and the Pacific Ocean just crashing in like an ancient partner to the trees. The trail ends up basically delivering you onto this giant beach. It's empty, not a soul around. I just watched just in time for the sunset. This is definitely a place that gets you thinking. Us humans can move so fast from one end of a spectrum to another, like a switch, from greed and annihilation to respect and protection. It's a shame we have to reach such a desperate point of loss before we realize what we stand to lose. Who knows what else we might yet discover in the natural world that has more value in a future time in history than we can ever imagine today. But today, this feels like a place that's bigger than the sum of its parts. The scientists, foresters, loggers, the indigenous peoples, all of them are a part of that, like a human ecosystem trying to understand the pieces of the natural ecosystem and trying to put them back together, trying to maintain the biodiversity of this special place with the help of the redwoods. There's a lot to learn from these ancient trees, some of the world's toughest survivors. And I'll definitely be coming back to walk under them and think about the biggest things in life. I have a quick update to our story for you here since we produced this episode. In March of 2024, the Yurok tribe was given back 125 acres of their land that's adjacent to the Redwood National and State Parks. A creek runs through the land that was an important fishing area for the Yurok, called the Orau. In a historic agreement, the Yurok will co-manage their land with the Redwood National and State Parks to restore the creek and surrounding wetlands and turn it into the gateway to the parks. This season of The Wild is about the incredible biodiversity in our national parks, from the tallest trees on the planet to the driest deserts and everything in between. And it's about the people working in and around our national parks to protect the natural world while we still can. As always, there are some great photographs and clips from our journey through the national parks on Instagram at The Wild Pod and at Chris Morgan Wildlife. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife with support from Wildlife Media. The show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us to continue to create this special immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to kuow.org/donate/thewild. Thank you. Our producer is Lucy Suchek. Jim Gates is our editor. It's hosted, produced and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for their kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Ellen Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellowlees, Barbara Stallman and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes David Brown, April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Gianotti-Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Matt Martin, Kara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggins-Schmidt, Brendan Sweeney and Hans Twite. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. Additional music by Carly Burke, also known as Arsis Marty. I'm Chris Morgan. Take care of yourselves and do what you can to take care of our beautiful planet. Thanks so much for listening.